Regional Development Australia, Perth, and here today we've got another great show for you. We've got Dr. Tom Rose. He's with us to talk about the environment, and he works for Ecoscope. And so, Tom, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Good morning. I sure can. I'm an environmental consultant who's got a lot of experience in government environmental work. I've been a regional manager, a coordinator, principal environmental officer, a regular senior environmental officer. I've been the whole bit in several environment portfolios. That's my government experience. And other than that, I have a PhD in estuarine ecology, or more specifically, food availability and estuarine ecology.
Brilliant. And I've known you for some time. We worked together several years ago on the first water quality improvement plan for Australia and Western Australia. Today we're going to talk about the Cockburn Sound. So there's a lot of activity that's taking place in Cockburn. So we've got Westport that's looking at the new port at Kwinana. There's the Australian Marine Complex. There's a lot of urban development that's happening there. And as I understand it, you've worked with Cockburn Sound quite a bit?
I sure have. I worked professionally in the Cockburn Sound for about 7 years. And only about 3 or 4 years ago, I stopped doing that and moved to another position in the Department of Environment Regulation at the time. But I used to be the coordinator manager there for the Cockburn Sound Management Council. All I can say right now is Cockburn Sound's in a very exciting period in its development and in its history.
Fantastic. So one of the big topics, or one of the things that a lot of people talk about when it comes to Cockburn, is the seagrass. Can you tell us about what is seagrass and how important is it?
Incredibly important. Cockburn Sound was one of the largest seagrass-dominated ecosystems in Western Australia, particularly in the southwest, but also, say, from Western Australia, Shark Bay down. Shark Bay being probably the largest seagrass embayment, and after that was probably Cockburn Sound, and then it's Geograph Bay. These are general statistics I'm throwing at you, but a very large seagrass environment. And for example, the changes, if people have a hard time imagining what Cockburn Sound would have been like had there not been, say, human development there. There was over 4,000 hectares of seagrass. It occupied basically almost all substrates except rock, essentially all the sandy substrates, from just splashing near the shore on the beach down to depths of 15 meters or so, which is pretty deep. So Cockburn Sound was a fairly clean embayment. It's roughly, I'd say about 120 square kilometers in surface area, maybe a little bit more. And of that, virtually anything that was less than 10 meters deep, bar some rocky outcrops and coral outcrops on the eastern part of Kwinana, or what we call the Kwinana Shelf, was all seagrass dominated. So seagrass was incredible. It nurtured a very highly productive fish ecology or fish community, a very productive invertebrate community that fed the fish, as well as allowed for some pretty large crabs to exist and some other things. And also it used to have quite a large scallop and prawn fishery. And then things have changed, of course, over the years, and nothing stays static even for a mature ecosystem that Cockburn Sound was.
And as I understand it, Cockburn is not an estuarine system, is that correct?
That's right. It is somewhat encircled, semi-encircled by Garden Island to the west, and then the hook from Mangles Bay or Point Perrin down and around to up to Woodman Point. And so it's semi-enclosed, but no, it's definitely very marine. And in the older days when we had wetter winters, you would get freshwater discharge that used to flow just on the surface of the water, would come out of the Swan, out of Frio, and spool or spin down into Cockburn Sound. And so that used to happen quite regularly. Not all the time, but quite regularly. Now it's extremely infrequent. I think the last time I really knew of any fresh water that went into Cockburn Sound was when we had Cyclone Vance 2000 and the large microcystis bloom in the Swan Canyon, where the cyclone kind of stalled in the inland parts of the Swan Avon and just discharged a hell of a lot of water. And that water nurtured a toxic blue-green algae bloom or blue-green cyanobacteria bloom. And that water, if so much of it flowed out, and this was in January, flowed out into Cockburn Sound, where we had basically estuarine fish and things like the jellyfish, the phylloryza that you see that we get in the lower parts of the Swan Canyon swimming around. So it was incredible. So no, it's not an estuary, very much a marine embayment.
So how does systems like this get managed with all the activity that is currently there and the future activity that's going to be planned?
Well, that's the tough one. You've kind of hit on a thing called multiple use, and based on the philosophy of beneficial multiple use. Cockburn Sound has been able to experience a lot of that. It's maybe better if I go back and explain a little bit of the history of development in Cockburn Sound.
Yeah, that would be good.
To then put multiple use into perspective. And it's very relevant then to then discuss future proposals for ports and harbors and things. Essentially, you start after World War II, other than the glorious times of the colonial periods when you had Clarence and some of these other early settlement startups around Rockingham and Cockburn Sound, or in Garden Island as well, or naval bases as well. After World War II, there was moves to really get WA more developed and more sufficient in contributing to the Australian economy. You had old companies that are now like BHP and things, Australian Iron and Steel, I think it used to be called, set up shop in what is now the Quinnon industrial area, as did CSBP with their fertilizer factory, and importantly, the BP refinery, which was the first large industrial estate, I believe, was established in the Quinnon industrial area. Now, these large industries, during the times in the 60s and early 70s, there was very little restraint on what they could discharge. Essentially, a lot of nutrients and waste went into Cockburn Sound, and over time generated very poor water quality. And then the federal government, or the Commonwealth government, wanted to develop Garden Island as a proper naval base. So they built the causeway. And the causeway was estimated to reduce water circulation in the Sound by about 40–45%. The result was you had a very poor, restricted, poorly flushed embayment known as Cockburn Sound, and it got more and more nutrient enriched to the point where all the seagrasses died off. Well, we lost essentially 80% of our seagrasses. And on that were studies that were made in the 70s, and they said, look, they found that nutrients were definitely the problem, particularly nitrogen. And there was an excess of 3,000 tons of nitrogen being discharged every year into Cockburn Sound. Well, industry took the issue very seriously and cleaned themselves up over a 15-year period. However, in the early 90s, government was also wanting to expand their wastewater treatment plant, the reticulated system that services Metro Perth.
Yeah, the Woodman Point?
Yeah, one at Woodman Point and also the other one at Point Perrin.
Okay.
Known as the Sepia Depression Ocean Outfall Line, or very appropriately nicknamed the Stool.
Yes, 33 gigaliters of water get discharged from that per year.
And that did a lot to save Cockburn Sound, but there was those kind of moves to clean up industrial activity so that they were less polluting, and studies that were also then done, more modern studies done in the early 90s to describe the system. And essentially, after that, the Cockburn Sound Management Council was established, and it was to oversee a policy to make sure Cockburn Sound stayed environmentally acceptable. And in that policy was enshrined this concept of multiple use benefits, so that you could have industry, you could have recreation, you could have defense, you could have aesthetic uses of the water, boating, yachting, swimming, everything that humans like to do, either to make money or to have fun, could be done in the sound. Unfortunately, that may work when a system is probably really quite healthy and the uses are very controlled, so you don't get too excessive. For example, recreational boat use, you don't leak too much petrol from your engines, you don't overfish, you don't drag your anchors, you don't go too fast where you run over surface penguins that are just bobbing up to get some air while they chase little fish. And
Penguins.
And penguins, but also dolphins and things like that. So that's the multiple use benefit philosophy. Everyone can use the system, multiple uses, and no one use should be to the disadvantage of other uses.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great way to come to a large compromise. How one does that sustainably can be more difficult to achieve. And by sustainable, I mean, look at Cockburn Sound as a cake, and if you look at its use and development over time, everyone's taken a slice of cake out of it. So the cake now is very much diminished. The cake slices that remain are fairly robust, and there's no real obvious things. Cockburn Sound's not going to just fall over tomorrow. However, over the long term, those slices of cake that remain may not be edible or remain as cake as we know it because of changes that are happening, like climate change, overuse, growing metropolitan access to the area, some industrial proposals that may be to the detriment of Cockburn Sound.
So what do we do as a community and as government to ensure that with this multi-use activity that is taking place and will continue to take place, what needs to be put in place? I mean, because we're in a period of high technological change and development, and I would think that with everything that we've learned and the things that we can develop, through drones and monitoring, that we should be able to manage the system and actually maintain or help it grow into the future.
Okay, that's it's an excellent question, but it in a way has some complicated answers. To be able to use the system the way we are now, or to have increased industrial development, for example, have a new port proposed to manage and deal with changes in trade, particularly, say, a lithium valley concept or value adding to our raw resource exports, and to feature them in the Quinnan industrial area so they can be serviced close to an ocean port. And then the increased navigation that would come with that boat use, as well as the development of the port, will put another added burden onto Cockburn Sound. And that's just an example. The way around that is to enhance or to reinvest back into Cockburn Sound. If we've lost 80% of our seagrasses, surely we can invest enough money to repay or rebuild the system to increase maybe 10 to 25% more seagrass coverage, and thereby enhance the productivity and the resilience of the system to, say, climate change, which is really in Cockburn Sound can be manifested two ways. That's increased water temperatures, so the water is going to get warmer. That brings new animals and plants in, as well as increased storminess with a gradual sea level rise. So the second thing is the storminess associated with sea level rise. And what that means is just that our beaches and stuff get more eroded or get hammered more with storms that come along. To get around, to be able to give the system a bit more resistance to those kind of changes, as well as address what I think is an economic need for us to pursue a lithium valley concept if WA is to be able to have an economy that can survive outside of boom-bust cycles. Then we need to look at investing in the system to manage those increased demands on the system. Now, you don't do that so that you make it economically unfeasible or unviable to develop a lithium value-adding train, for example, with lithium ores, or for that matter, other kind of ores or agricultural products, or just the other existing products that are produced now with fertilizers and various metals and oxides and stuff to service the mining industry. What Quinnon industrial area, the industries in there do quite well. What we need to do is put this effort back into Cockburn Sound and then carefully manage those developments so that they don't impact unnecessarily on the system. The history of environmental impact assessment in WA is pretty good. Our environmental protection laws, believe it or not, in my argument, I would say they're good. I think our environmental regulations are very good, and I think our Part 4 of the Environmental Protection Act, which is the assessment of proposals that might have a detrimental impact on the environment, are fairly rigorous. But while we may have a fairly open system and make demands on proponents to put up good information, what they essentially do is still allow development to occur. They're just doing it in the most modern way. So what I want to just put a caveat in this discussion, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I believe we need to go beyond the environmental protection aspects of our environmental laws and invest back in Cockburn Sound. And that's the thing that I'm going to call, and I forgive the philosophers who know it much better than I do, but this thing called ecological rationalism. That if only we all lived green, if only we only used the best green products, if only we had a very reduced minimal carbon footprint on the earth, we could all live with 100 kabillion people on the earth. We can't. We come up against the third law of thermodynamics. The more human creatures that exist on this earth, the greater is demand on its natural ecosystems to give us air, clean water, and food, land to grow food, or oceans to grow food. So a way around it, with care, technology will help make our impacts much reduced. It still will be an impact. So it goes back to the cake analogy. We're still going to be taking a slice of cake out, even though it might be micro thin, really clean, nary a crumb that will fall from that slice, but it will still be the removal of the cake. So to get around that, I'm now trying to argue and get people familiar with this concept. I don't want to call it offsets. Offsets has kind of a very convoluted, what I would say almost a negative connotation. In a sense, what sustainability used to have a number of years ago has now become positive.
A little bit like, let's take that sliver of cake and put the cupcake over there.
That's been a problem with offsets, is we're going to smash your computer, but we'll improve your energy supply in the next room. And that's been fair enough. Overall, it meant the house still has a better energy budget. It's just that you've lost the ability to use that computer where it was. And so it's a complex discussion.
Yes.
But what I want to do is kind of get back to the idea that we reinvest in it. The system can, in a way, absorb or buffer itself against that well-managed development, which I believe the authorities would do quite well.
RDA Perth and its partners have just released the Lithium Valley report. And what we found through that particular report was a really big interest in ethical sourcing and a whole range of things, so which puts Australia in a very good stead in terms of that. But in that, we also spoke about establishing a strategic industrial park. And I was just wondering, in terms of this reinvestment back into the environment, maybe that could be a component of anybody entering into the Lithium Valley Concept Park, that there might be a contribution towards an investment fund, maybe, for Cockburn to actually manage and make sure that these things happen. What do you think about that? Do you think that's something that might work?
Yes, wholeheartedly support the concept. I can see, I don't mean to look like I see obstacles or to be an obstacle maker, so to speak, because I want to facilitate something in that direction. Is the politics has to be carefully managed. And what worries me is that in our political spectrum in WA is any concept of a contribution, a levy, a tax, an offset fund or something in that regard, it's just called a tax. And then it's used in a very derogatory way by short-term thinking, perhaps, proponents, that then it's a tax, it's green tape, it's unnecessary. There has to be, in essence, a very strong support by both political parties or by the political establishment. That means the Greens, the Libs, and Labour. And whatever groups have to agree that if we are to be able to successfully reinvest in our natural environments so that we can have both development that lets us stay employed and make money and have the ability to make these changes, as well as keep our environment the way we love it here in WA, where we can still see birds, beautiful white-tailed black cockatoos coming around, or where we can still have large trees to visit or incorporate into our urban designs and things like that. If we want to retain what I call WA, and I've only been here 35 years in Western Australia, I can't shake my accent, but it's a beautiful state, and I want to keep.
Neither can I.
Yeah, it's lovely talking to a person from the old country. But seriously, we can do that if we can break out of our 1950s, 60s dialectic, which is a kind of a conflict between the right and the left. And really, the bottom line is you can reinvest in Cockburn Sound, rebuilding its natural environment, if you give it enough money, if you give it enough long-term horizon to make things work, and you do enough to actually make a change to the system. So those are three critical important components to anything that comes out of, say, an investment or a contribution to an environment fund or to a resilience fund or to a restoration fund or an environmental levy or whatever you want to call it. With new developments coming into WA, particularly in the Kwinana industrial area, in the Newport we've been talking about, Lithium Valley is a beautiful, beautiful opportunity to let this happen. Where what you can do is put, we'll call it a levy just for simplistic reasons, in throughput through the port can be, there can be a 50 cent, a dollar, $2. We have to go through the numbers more thoroughly to come up with a number that can give an investment fund in the environment a chance to work. So we have to look at what would be the levy, and I suspect it's between the 50 cents and $2 range. Anything more than that, I think we would create an uncompetitive disadvantage to setting up new industries in the Kwinana industrial area. And so it has to be carefully looked at through economists and careful, hardcore environmental economics.
Yeah. So do you think, because I know there's a number of groups out there that don't want anything to happen in Cockburn, and do you think that if we were able to demonstrate, that there's an investment fund or a resilience fund, I really like that term, to look after and continue to grow and rehabilitate, some of Cockburn, do you think that would satisfy some of those groups?
I think it's the only strategy that might satisfy them. In my previous past, where I was manager of the Swan Canning Cleanup Program, which was an initiative done in the late 90s for the Swan Canning, which was able to come up with about $20 million over 5 to 7 years. That effort recognized, and I experienced firsthand, and I feel very strongly for it, within people, within the community that care about the environment. You have, to make it real simplistic, and if you're going to go and be a lecturer on it, for example, you have the preservationists, the NIMBYs next to it, or not in my backyard. You can do anything anywhere else, but not in my backyard. And then you have grades of conservationists to what I will call greenwash components. And so it's a spectrum. And the community that feels strongly about, well, we don't want Cockburn Sound to get any worse. We actually want it to get better. And we can't see a large industrial port being a contribution to the system. The only way I believe that you can make those people in that community, and it's a heartfelt sentiment, and it's legitimate when you think of the cake analogy, or the fact that we've lost 80% of our seagrasses, just as one crude measure of the impact of development on Cockburn Sound. The only way you're going to be able to assuage their feelings or let them be more tolerant and accepting of a port is if they can see an investment that increases seagrass, gives them greater availability or opportunity to fish for maybe a greater range of fish, or to be able to alter and improve or increase bag limits and size limits and things like that. Things that enhance the fishing experience, as well as improve water quality, so that your ascetics, the sailors, the swimmers, people like that can also appreciate it. Or other growing industries like the ecotourism, and even maybe aquaculture could find a room in all of this, to let those things, those other multiple uses flourish, as well as perhaps increase, will require that investment in the environment. It requires probably three things. One is that the development itself is done environmentally very well. It's had the best code of practice, best international practice of development of an international port or of a new industrial port. It's had a thorough but not onerous, ridiculously redundant, unnecessarily redundant environmental impact assessment, but one that's relevant to what would be affected in the environment. In other words, a high-risk assessment and review of data and stuff, so that those aspects can be managed down in the development of the port. It requires then a large investment into the ecosystem of Cockburn Sound, so that would have seagrass, fisheries, invertebrates, things we know probably not as well as we should know about the invertebrates or the non-backboned animals, the worms, the clams, the gibbelis that live in the sand and in the mud, both in the deep and in the shallow. We need to look at them and see what we can do to enhance them so they can be, without sounding too brutal, also help enhance the food chain. Then we need to look at our fish community. And so what we have to do is be clever about how we invest in the resilience of Cockburn Sound. It's not going to be a textbook 1950s approach. It has to be something where we can use the expertise we have in WA, and we do have a lot of good expertise here, to develop a strategic, high probability of success program or campaign to invest back into Cockburn Sound. And then I think once that happens, and we keep on encouraging people to don't overfish, not to be wasteful, not to have respect for the environment that they're exploiting, I think that will help bring down that community outrage, which was very outspoken in the 70s and in parts of the 90s, that have led to things like the Cockburn Sound Management Council, state environmental policy, and a sensitivity to Cockburn Sound. We need to, because it's the second largest snapper fishery as well.
Oh, wow.
The second largest snapper spawning grounds, I should say, in western WA. So from Shark Bay, which has the largest snapper spawning grounds, down to Cockburn Sound, which is the second largest, with a certain amount in geograph and around some of the other embayments. To keep that going and to make sure that happens so everyone can enjoy the environment and exploit it with deep respect and conservation use of it, but in other words, still be able to fish, but not be bad fishermen. We need to invest back in the environment. What excites me about this is if you have a development that does contribute to such a fund, to a resilience fund, or there doesn't have to be a development like a port that will have an impact on sound, but also around the surrounds of Cockburn Sound, to enhance vegetation cover or strategically improve aspects of the industrial area or the buffer zone around the area, or other areas within the Rockingham, Kwinana, Cockburn area, and even Mandurah area, of that greater area that enhances our existing environment. We can get around that outrage, but what we can also do is what the lessons we learn from that can then be applied to other systems in WA. And then if we really bed down our expertise, let us learn how to make money repairing the environment, and we can teach them over east in New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland, because I think they need some help, and internationally. So what we can do is set up a resilience or a restoration institute or a marine center. Yes. And then export that expertise. And all that can be a part of the development of a lithium valley. Or not just lithium valley, but let's get, I think lithium valley is excellent and stick to it. But I think there will be secondary development streams that can use maybe a smaller scale than the lithium valley one. But they can also tag along and use the lithium valley as a model to feed into that new port. At the same time, we can see Cockburn Sound return to its health. That's my fantasy.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for coming on the show today to talk about Cockburn Sound. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought to consider on how we can, look at improving Cockburn Sound. So, thank you to everyone for joining us today, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you.